that are on the outside of it.
I think that some of the evidence came through, which is a very good news, that the truth is emerging.
The hearing is scheduled to end on Tuesday. There may or there may not be a final ruling on the extradition. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera in London.
The British Prime Minister has said that the decision to release the only man convicted of the 1988 Pan Am Lockerbie bombing was, quote, profoundly wrong. It comes as a new report shows the UK's previous government did all it could to help Libya win the release of Abdelbaset al-Megrahi, despite saying the decision came from Scotland. Paul Brennan explains.
The release of the Lockerbie bomber Abdelbaset al-Megrahi in 2009 is still the source of considerable anger in America and the UK. Megrahi remains the only person to have been convicted of involvement in the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in 1988. Megrahi's freedom was granted by the devolved authorities in Scotland on compassionate grounds, on the basis that he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. But the new review reveals that while officially keeping its distance, behind the scenes, the government of Prime Minister Gordon Brown in London was doing all it could to secure Megrahi's release.
And yet, a year later, when the Scottish Government, under due process of Scots law, did release Mr Megrahi, then we were roundly attacked by the Labour Party in Scotland, viciously attacked, and Gordon Brown was absolutely silent. I haven't seen a more case of more organised hypocrisy in my political lifetime.
The assistance was considerable. On October the 8th, 2008, the UK government minister Bill Rammell met his Libyan counterpart Abdulati al-Abidi. On October the 17th, Mr Rammell followed it up with a letter. The two men met again on November 17th. On December the 1st, the British ambassador gave further procedural advice. At a third meeting in February of 2009, Mr Rammell assured the Libyans that the UK did not want Megrahi to die in a British jail. Just 3 months later, the Libyans formally requested Megrahi's release.
Insufficient consideration was given to the most basic question of all. Was it really right for the British government to facilitate an appeal by the Libyans to the Scottish government in the case of an individual who was convicted of murdering 270 people?
The Prime Minister may bitterly disagree with the policies of his predecessor, but this review does at least crucially dispel some of the more fanciful and damaging conspiracy theories associated with this case. Yes, British government policy had changed. Yes, it had changed because of significant political and business factors. But there was no evidence that London had improperly pressurised the Scottish authorities, nor that the oil giant BP had had any bearing on the Megrahi case. Nonetheless, such details will be scant consolation to those relatives bereaved by the Lockerbie bombing. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, I'll be back with more news from Europe a little later in the programme. Now let's go back to Rida in Doha.
Thank you very much, Barbara. People living in a disputed region on the Thai-Cambodian border have been forced to flee a fourth day of fighting between troops from the two countries. We'll have more on that story, and bushfires rage across Western Australia. We'll report on the destruction of homes across a vast area.
Qatar, as independent as you are.
It is in the details, a look, a connection, the moments that reveal the truth. Witness documentaries to open your eyes at this time on Al Jazeera.
See the world from every angle and every side. Al Jazeera.
Welcome back. You're watching Al Jazeera. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Southern Sudan has voted overwhelmingly to break away from the north. Official results confirm that 98.83% of voters backed secession. A new nation will be created on July 9th. Talks between the Egyptian government and opposition groups about the country's political crisis have failed to appease protesters across the country. Thousands of demonstrators are still on the streets, demanding the immediate resignation of President Hosni Mubarak. Al Jazeera has obtained new pictures of the most violent night of the demonstrations, showing protesters on both sides of the divide suffering brutal attacks. Well, reporting restrictions in Egypt have made it difficult and dangerous for journalists to do their jobs. Al Jazeera's Ayman Muhyiddin was briefly detained by the military in Cairo. Here's what he told us about his time in custody.
What was really troubling about it wasn't the fact that I was blindfolded or handcuffed and asked to sit on the pavement for 5 hours or interrogated, but really some of the images that I saw there along with other journalists about how some of the detainees who were not journalists and how they were being treated by the Egyptian military. We saw them use a great deal of force to try to subdue many of these people that were there, and it was a very disturbing image to see the type of violence that was used, the type of intimidation and the type of tactics. I don't think it was very becoming of this military to use those tactics on people that were already disarmed, people that were widely already seen as at that particular point harmful to a powerful military. So the experience overall very disturbing to say the least. And certainly one that highlights, I think, the difficulty of the military in trying to find itself in this very tight or difficult line that it is trying to walk right now.
Thai and Cambodian troops have clashed for a fourth day along a disputed border near a 900-year-old temple. The fighting has forced residents to flee from their rural villages, as Wayne Hay reports.
Living near the Thai-Cambodia border can come at a cost. In recent days, an ongoing land dispute has shattered the peace in this otherwise sleepy Thai settlement. The owner of this house told us she managed to evacuate before a Cambodian artillery shell landed at her back door. This was the scene the night before, dozens of Thai shells streaking across the sky towards Cambodia. Despite the aggression from both sides, the Thai Prime Minister called for a peaceful solution, but said his country will continue to defend itself.
When there is firing into Thai territory, it's necessary for Thailand to protect its sovereignty. We counter the attack and we return fire only at military targets.
However, Cambodian television showed footage of the ancient Preah Vihear temple in the middle of the disputed area, which they allege was damaged by shelling. In Thai territory, the soldiers remain on edge. At checkpoints, supplies are being rushed to the front line. The border villages are now largely deserted. People who have stayed behind say they're ready for more fighting. They've armed themselves and are preparing new bunkers to shelter in. Those who aren't digging in are being catered for in the relative safety of a nearby town.
The residents who have fled the fighting have come here to evacuation centres. In this one alone, there are around 9,000 people. Most of them say they're in no mood to go home anytime soon.
I will continue to stay here until the fighting stops.
Given the tension on the border, these people may be here for some time yet. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Kantaralak, Thailand.
Emergency warnings have been issued for areas of Western Australia as bushfires continue to spread. The blaze has destroyed dozens of homes near the state capital Perth, and more properties are now under threat. Andrew Thomas has more.
After widespread floods and a tropical cyclone, the latest natural disaster to hit Australia, bushfires. Southeast of the West Australian capital Perth, a spark from industrial equipment lit bone-dry grass. A second fire developing to the north of the city.
And whilst Victoria battles floodwaters, over in the west, people are battling bushfires. And we've seen the loss of homes. People who have been through the devastation of knowing that all of their possessions are gone, many of them not able to take things with them that are precious to them and which are now lost.
Gusty winds fanned the flames, houses in their path destroyed, and residents urged to abandon property.
All of a sudden the police just came along and said, please move along now, like the fire has jumped with the wind and everyone had to leave.
During daylight, the fire is being fought from the air, as well as from land. But it's been overnight, when helicopters can't fly, that the flames have been at their most destructive.
It's horrendous conditions. We knew it was going to be difficult to control. These sort of fires overnight, we don't have the aerial support, but the ground crews get in there and do their best to protect